the geophysics occurring during the global flood basically rolled the Earth. Okay, it shifted its equator so that now, the magnetically, opposed north and south poles, they're tilted. So because of that, those regions of the Earth, they're not going to get enough sunlight. Because of that tilt, whereas if it was upright, there would be no problem. So there's a problem with the specific location of those regions of the Earth. The freezing of the North and the South Poles occurred during the flood. Then there was a rapid melting event, probably 1,000 years after, which increased, the sea level, rose the sea level, and then overfilled natural lakes, or overfilled lakes, which then breached over their natural dams and created massive canyons like the Grand Canyon.
They said, now, Mr. Hovind, we know you teach the Earth is only 6,000 years old. We would like to prove to you that you're wrong. I get this just about every week. You probably will too, right? These guys worked at the Denver National Ice Core Laboratory. Denver National Ice Core Laboratory. It is a section of the Federal Center in Denver, Colorado. What you're seeing here is a picture of a giant freezer. This freezer is enormous. The guys who brought me into this freezer, it's 36 below zero in there all the time. Taxpayers are paying the electric bill, so, set it where you're comfortable. The freezer is enormous. These were the guys that go to Greenland and drill holes through the ice. They also go to the South Pole and drill holes. The Russians are doing this too. And they take these, it's called a coring machine. Here's a picture of one here. It's like a pipe. It drills down, maybe a 4-inch pipe. It drills down just the outside. So the center part is not disturbed. It's called a coring machine. So they pull up a 6-foot piece of ice about this big, slide it into a tube and mark it. This is number, 813 or whatever it was. Then they can go back to the laboratory and put them in order and reassemble it. So they have a huge long core. 10 ice core samples yanked from a remote Antarctic glacier are resting in a giant freezer here waiting to be tested. But there are dark and light lines, which I'll show you in a minute. The guys took me in the freezer and they showed me these lines. And here's a photograph of one. You can see the dark and light lines. They said, now, Mr. Hovind, up in Greenland, it doesn't snow much, and it's really cold in the winter. In the summer, the snow melts just a little, and you get a layer of water on top. Then it refreezes in the winter and makes a clear layer of ice. Now, clear ice on this picture shows up as a dark line. If it never gets a chance to melt, the snow is going to pack or press down and make a white layer of ice. So they said what these layers represent is summer and winter, summer, winter, summer, winter, summer, winter. Well, that's not true, as we'll see. This rest of this newspaper article said, in Greenland and Antarctica, where the weather is consistently dry and very cold, the glaciers are miles thick, but the annual rings are very thin. Summer, winter. Now here's where the problem is, right here. The deepest cores can measure over 10,000 feet. Cores from Greenland drilled since 1990 show the northern climate was erratic 135,000 years ago. All they do, you count back 135,000 rings and assume we can look at the weather patterns. Just because you got a clear line and a white line, packed snow and melted snow, doesn't mean it's annual, does it? This is the Lost Squadron.
Down in this valley of the Cumberland Gap, where Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee converge, a World War II fighter plane is being restored to flying condition. For 50 years, this P-38 Lightning was buried in an icy grave until it was finally rescued by a team of adventurers. The plane was dug out of the ice, 268 feet below the surface of Greenland, where it crash-landed in 1942, while on its way to fight Hitler's Germany. The recovery expedition was financed and captained by Roy Schaffner, a former Air Force fighter pilot who fell in love with a chapter of forgotten history. Decades of ice and snow blew across the tundra of the Greenland ice cap and encased the bombers and fighters in a glacier hundreds of feet below the surface. For nearly half a century, the airmen would continue to tell their stories, but their planes were believed lost forever, trapped in one of the world's most unforgiving climates. Treasure hunters and World War II enthusiasts were intrigued by the possibility of recovering the planes, since they were almost new when abandoned on the ice cap. In 1983, the aircraft were located by radar.
And they had originally thought that these planes would be sitting there on the surface, and they simply clear the snow off and fly them out. But as it turned out, they were 263 feet below.
Airplanes are always built nose heavy. The front of the plane is heavier than the back. Why would they do that way? What if your engines quit running? You want to glide in head first or tail first? Well, head first, right? So airplanes are always built with over 50% of the weight in the front. If those planes were sinking down because of gravity, they would be crooked. They're not. They're flat. Secondly, things don't sink through the ice based on their own gravity if everything is uniformly cold. Bob Carden is the guy who dug out the airplane. He was in charge of the project. There's his phone number right there. I said, Bob, when you went down to get the airplanes, did you notice rings above the airplanes? He said, well, yeah. You can see them on the picture here. See the dark and light lines? I said, how many lines were there, Bob? He said, oh, we never counted them, but there were many hundreds of them. Now, how do you get many hundreds of annual rings in 48 years? You don't, do you? Those aren't annual rings. That's not summer, winter, summer, winter. It's warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold. You can get 20 of those in 1 week in Minnesota, can't you? Sure you can. Those are not annual rings. This picture a guy sent me just a few weeks ago. He said, Mr. Hovind, I saw your tape. He said, I live in Alaska. He said, we had a snowstorm one night. He said, I got 15 layers of snow on my car in 8 hours. Those aren't annual rings. The Inuit Indians, he said, have 42 or 43 different words for snow. There's soft snow, hard snow, crystalline snow, granular snow, slippery snow. Different words. And so in one snowstorm, you can get all sorts of layers.
Creation to the present. 6,000 years ago, God made everything. 4,500 years ago, there was a flood. And then maybe 3,500 years ago, you have this great melting event, okay? And it basically causes a rapid melting of the ice that is on the North and South Poles, causing sea levels to rise, causing lakes to overflow, and that's why you'd have the Grand Canyon forming, where the sediment that was all deposited from a global flood is still relatively soft, and so when the lakes overflow, they're able to cut a massive canyon into the earth. The earth was covered in ice during the flood, and then the ice melted probably 1,000 years later, 2500 BC, I would say. The earth is covered in ice on the North and South Poles, but it stretches nearly to Kansas City, Missouri. Like if you're in North America, it covers mostly Europe. And then about 1,000 years after that, it would melt, and that melting is what's going to cause those lakes to overflow.
If you built a dam across Grand Canyon, a huge lake would fill in behind it, covering several states, okay? I mean, take a lot of dirt to build a dam, but if you could build a dam across that canyon, you'd have a really big lake. Actually, some of the water from Wyoming drains through the Grand Canyon. It has a huge drainage pattern. There's a picture of it, satellite false color image. You can see Grand Canyon right there, a big gash right across a ridge in the mountains. You folks in Tennessee know what a ridge is. Not really a mountain, just a big long ridge, okay? These two red lines indicate what's called the snow line, okay? Between those two red lines is a ridge that gets about 6,900 to 8,500 feet above sea level. Now, the river enters the canyon at the far right over there at 2,800 foot elevation. The river flows downhill for 270 miles. Comes out the other side. If you look at it from a side view, a schematic view, it'll look like this. The river comes in 2,800 foot elevation. The ground rises up while the river goes down for 270 miles. I said, now, sir, there's a few things you ought to consider about this canyon. I said, did you know the top of Grand Canyon is higher than the bottom? He said, obviously. I said, sir, did you know the river only runs through the bottom? I said, sir, did you know rivers don't flow uphill in Tennessee? There's no delta. Where's the mud that washed out of Grand Canyon? Nobody has a clue, okay? That river did not make that canyon. Grand Canyon's a washed-out spillway. There used to be two big lakes, Grand Lake and Hopi Lake. The lakes are long gone, but the beaches are still there. You can still see the beach line. They got too full and went over the top and washed out that canyon in a hurry.
Fossil forests in New Siberian islands. There are vast floating remains of forests that have been washed up on New Siberian islands well inside the Arctic Circle, and thousands of miles from comparable forests today. Like nothing, there's no forest in that region today. There's certainly no tropical forest growing there. So there's an entire forest though that's under all the ice. The Energy Non-Crisis Second Edition. Though the ground is frozen toward 1,900 feet down from the surface of Prudhoe Bay, everywhere the oil companies drilled around this area, they discovered an ancient tropical forest. It is between 1,100 and 1,700 feet down. There are palm trees, pine trees, tropical foliage in great profusion. In fact, they found them lapped all over each other, just as though they had fallen in that position. October 2007, Richard Firestone, evidence for an extraterrestrial impact 12,900 years ago that contributed to the megafaunal extinctions and the Younger Dryas cooling. The Younger Dryas cooling is when they say that the North and South Poles did experience a rapid melting event, which they put at 10,000 years ago. But if you stick with the biblical timeline, it puts it to 4,500 or about 3,500 years ago. Mammoth Ivory, Annual Report of the Board Regents of Smithsonian Institution, 1899. They say, in that article that mammoth ivory is remarkably preserved. Exposure in their ordinary condition would speedily deteriorate the quality of the ivory. I mean, you can research this stuff. It's part of observational science. We know that the mammoths were buried quickly by ice, just the preservation of the the ivory, the preservation of the food remains that were undigested in their stomach. So the entire animal had to be frozen quickly, and that would take extremely cold temperatures to do that. Evidence of plant and animal DNA along with their remains clearly reveals an ecosystem of lush vegetation and tropical animals. The world before the flood was very tropical, okay? And then the north and south poles of that world were quickly covered in ice. That is why there is a tropical forest on the north and south poles. That is why there are tropical animals in those same layers of strata, the permafrost, really, that's under all the ice. According to Science Volume 253, a recent Japanese study extracted longer strands of nuclear DNA, which showed the mammoth to be more closely related to an Indian elephant. Just because it's like got hair all over it, that doesn't necessarily mean it's supposed to be living in the cold. It's got a trunk, and the trunk cannot even survive cold weather. According to H. Newville, on the extinction of the mammoth annual report of Smithsonian Institution 1919, comparative study of 350 mitochondrial DNA nucleotides indicated that the mammoth is closely related to African and Indian elephants. It is directly related, just like the woolly rhinoceros. It is an elephant. And so if it's an elephant, genetically, there's no way that it can even survive that cold of temperatures. Research that and read this research for yourself, where they examined the hair of it and said that it was not wool, technically, like a wool that would be like on a sheep, or like an insulating wool on a bear, like a polar bear. It's different. It's actually just hair. Harold Lamb, Hannibal, One Man Against Rome, nonfiction book about Hannibal, and he actually crossed the Alps with 37 elephants, but the cold weather killed all of them but one. There's no way that an elephant can survive in cold weather with no fur, which the mammoth doesn't have, just has hair. So it's not even possible. Their trunks are extremely delicate to the cold. The conclusion is that something suddenly froze the north and south poles in ice, and the ice retreated sometime later to its current location. Certain animals found near mammoth fossils, along with the lush vegetation, do not live in cold climates today. Many of them do, like rhinos and tigers. Geographical extent: northern portions of Asia, Europe, and North America contain the remains of extinct species of the elephant, the mammoth, the rhinoceros, together with those of horses, oxen, deer, other large quadrupeds. That was Smithsonian Exploration in Alaska, 1904. Miscellaneous Collections, Volume 49. All kinds of tropical animals in the same permafrost as the woolly mammoth, so it was in a tropical environment. The frozen mud and uprooted vegetation of the pre-flood world covered the north and south poles, along with super cold ice that rained down for 40 days and 40 nights. Probably no ice caps, far smaller oceans in a single ocean, mostly landmass before the flood, whereas today the earth is 70% covered by water. Because of the flood, people ask, where did all the water go to flood the earth? Well, just look around. Less than 50% of this planet, 15% of this planet, is even habitable by man. Most of it is covered in water and ice and desert. The tilt of the earth is why those regions are really permanently frozen, because they don't get enough sunlight. When it was tilted during the flood because of the formation of the Himalayan mountains, East 90 Ridge,
the ground became permanently frozen. And so you have all the ice on top of the tropical forest continues to stay frozen because the formation of the Himalayan mountains created a bulge on the earth, which caused it to roll and to settle in a tilted position.